The morning light carved sharp rectangles across the Montgomery dining room as Victor set the terms of war with a gesture, not a speech. Keys clinked like shackles on polished wood. A phone, a thin black mirror, lost its power the minute it left a hand. Credit cards, lacquered symbols of invincibility, turned into dead plastic under a father's stare. Across from him, Asher felt the invisible walls of the estate inch inward, expensive air growing thin. Servants ghosted along the margins, trained to ignore the quiet violence of wealth disciplining its own. The empire's patriarch upheld a creed older than the portraits on the wall. Privilege is conditional, affection a ledger. Outside, fountains whispered of a softer world. Inside, a dynasty chose hardness. The air walked away lighter in pockets and heavier in bones, sentenced to an ordinary road he'd never learned to travel. Northwood's corridors smelled of wax and legacy, trophies staring down like stern ancestors. A paper slid onto Asher's desk, a bright red brand across the top. Failure wore no mystery here. It came stamped, filed, and indexed against the family name that underwrote entire buildings. Teachers had learned to announce disappointment in polite tones, the way one discusses weather. The son of the Titan drifted through lectures like a passenger in turbulence, bracing for impact without fastening a single belt. Numbers on pages refused to bend to entitlement. Concepts resisted purchase. The gradebook, a blunt instrument, recorded apathy with clinical precision. Somewhere, a guidance file thickened by another page. Somewhere else, gossip tightened its circle. The boy who owned the season's newest everything found himself owning nothing that mattered. He folded the paper once, then twice, small enough to hide, but never small enough to forget.
The bus exhaled a tired hiss at the curb, its yellow paint dulled by rain and years. Asher climbed aboard with the uncertain steps of royalty stripped mid-crowning. Vinyl seats cracked like old knuckles. Diesel settled into the throat. Laughter traveled in quick, sharp currents, practiced and precise. Brent Jennings observed from the aisle like a junior warden, monitoring order in a jail he considered his. Windows reflected two worlds at once, mansions shrinking behind, row homes gathering ahead. The ride taught a lesson no prep school had offered. Silence could bruise, and proximity could sting more than distance. Every bump reminded him the road was the only thing treating everyone the same. For 20 measured minutes, the air's spine learned the weight of eyes that don't expect miracles, don't fear names, and don't forgive weakness. When the bus lurched to a stop, he understood why insults prefer public transit. Evening returned to the estate like a ritual, lamps blooming against glass, art glowing in curated pools. In Victor's world, history functioned as a report, not a wound. Ancestors stared from gilt frames, their achievements aligned like columns of revenue. The house behaved as an argument for inevitability. Asher drifted through corridors where marble remembered every footfall and rugs swallowed every regret. Pride did not shout here. It hummed, persistent as an engine. The dining table, nearly a runway, displayed silver arranged with military precision, evidence that order could masquerade as love. Somewhere beyond the hedges, regular families divided rent by the week and reheated pasta. Inside, a father believed pressure was mercy, and a son felt pressure like weather, inescapable and mood-altering. The difference between legacy and gravity narrowed to a single sensation. Both kept you pinned, unless you learned to change the way you stood.
Northwood's guidance office carried the warm fatigue of a school nurse's bay, softly lit and full of second chances. Files stacked like quiet verdicts. Evelyn Carter's calendar overflowed with triage for futures in varying degrees of collapse. Asher sat with the practiced shrug of someone allergic to consequences. Numbers spoke first, attendance thin, Assignments missing, assessments wounded. The language of outcomes waited for translation, and no translator arrived. She watched him the way gardeners watch weather, knowing the plant might refuse even the best tending. She offered clear paths, ordinary steps, and unglamorous repairs. He treated solutions like souvenirs from a city he never planned to visit. When the bell released him back to corridors that worshipped victories, the room held the afterimage of a boy carrying a name that opened doors and a mindset that closed every single one. Potential lingered, like a light left on. Afternoons sank into the mansion with the hush of a museum after hours. Staff moved by choreography, calibrating perfection to the minute. Asher wandered its silences like a ghost with privileges. Pools reflected a sky he rarely looked at. A theater waited for laughter he didn't feel. Guest suites prepared for people he didn't know. Wealth presented itself as solution, but it solved nothing that woke him at night. The house amplified exhaustion the way a cathedral amplifies prayer. Every groan of the soul echoed. He paused in the garage where engines slept under stitched covers, each machine a promise he never collected. The pantry's abundance made hunger theoretical. The library's miles of spines made knowledge decorative. He touched a doorframe and realized the house would outlive every version of him unless he changed the terms. Luxury can be a lullaby. It can also be a lull.
He took the coastal road without a destination, chasing a horizon that always refused appointments. The ocean met him with practiced indifference. Waves lifted, collapsed, and erased evidence with professional efficiency. On the rocks, gulls argued about nothing and everything, their complaints swallowed by wind. He watched the repetitive violence of water against stone and considered how many chances it takes to make a shape. The sea did not promise reinvention, it promised abrasion, the slow carve of persistence. In the windshield reflection, a boy with all advantages wore a face the ocean did not recognize. The tide clocked in, tireless and underpaid. Far offshore, boats worked a living from uncertainty. The shoreline reminded him that futures are built by hands that blister and minds that refuse numbness. He parked until twilight blurred edges and then drove back, no wiser but less committed to staying asleep. Dust turned golden in shafts of evening light, lifting from leather bindings as though ideas had weight. Asher entered the library expecting quiet and found purpose kneeling by the baseboards. Clara Maid Thompson balanced a paperback on one knee while her small hand scrubbed the molding with patient circles. The room's grandeur treated her like furniture. She treated the room like a puzzle. Her presence rearranged the air. She didn't perform her work, she inhabited it. The pages she read belonged to thinkers who learned in trenches, in kitchens and fields, not at fundraisers. Without ceremony, her attention cut the room into truth and decoration. He stood at a distance and felt a thin seam open in the day's indifference. The mansion had always instructed him to look at objects. Around Clara, the lesson shifted. Observation became participation, and the library felt, for once, like a place that read back.
Shame arrived quietly, not as accusation, but as contrast. Asher watched Clara organize her world by effort and curiosity, neither of which required luck. Her presence made the house's glossy surfaces look like omissions. He saw a child whose family cleaned other people's lives for money, learning to interpret the world with scavenged books and inherited wisdom. The comparison drafted its own report card. He had mistaken boredom for sophistication, apathy for armor. The estate's art supplied colors. Her attention supplied meaning. Shame is a teacher with blunt tools. It redraws priorities without asking permission. He felt the small crack that forms when excuses finally run out. The room did not move, yet something shifted. Not redemption, not yet.
only the awareness that he had been measuring days by how little they demanded. The difference between looking and seeing stood up, stretched, and asked to be fed. Hope rarely arrives grandly. It slips in behind ordinary tasks, drags a chair to the table and waits. That night, the estate ticked along its schedule, and Asher felt a new current beneath the predictability. The ingredients were simple: a quiet child with a backbone of steel, a journal of field-born wisdom, and a boy suddenly tired of being indifferent. He lay in a bed designed for princes and noticed how ceilings can feel closer when you start wanting more. Outside, hedges squared themselves against the dark. Somewhere in the staff wing, Susan folded towels with a care the house never noticed. Hope asked for something he'd never paid: attention, without applause. In that modest exchange, an heir discovered a currency that couldn't be charged to any account. Morning would come demanding either surrender or change. For once, he leaned toward change, even if it scratched.
Morning gathered in dew along the lawn, beads of light strung on blades like a necklace no one claimed. Clara stood by the ancient oak with the alert stillness of a scout, inviting the world to speak before anyone interrupted it. Asher crouched and learned how ignorance camouflages as certainty. Ants carried disproportionate burdens. A spider corrected damage without lament. Moss mapped shade with quiet logic. The oak's roots shrugged at property lines, honoring laws older than deeds. The lesson refused glamour and offered patience. Seeing requires longer breath and smaller judgments. Wind moved leaves into conversations he'd never attended. He realized how often he had walked without noticing his feet. The garden wrote a syllabus in living ink, and he finally enrolled. When the sun reached the hedges, he stood with knees damp and mind sharpened. For the first time, luxury had to wait its turn. By noon, the mansion's kitchen throbbed with urgency. Pans hissed, knives performed metronomes on wood, and ovens exhaled heat like engines. André Rousseau's crew moved in organized panic, each station a neighborhood with strict zoning. Clara guided Asher's attention past the noise to rhythms. Steady cuts from practiced hands, erratic clatter from the new hire, the confident sear of protein hitting iron, and the anxious sputter of a sauce approaching ruin. Hierarchy revealed itself in volume and restraint. Discipline tasted like salt. He began to understand that excellence has a soundtrack and panic has a smell. Kitchens don't care about surnames, they grade in real time. He stood near a rack of copper and let the orchestra of labor tune his senses. In that heat, he confronted the truth that meaning blooms under pressure when skill meets urgency. The lesson plated itself without garnish.
In a sunroom saturated with polite light, a chessboard waited mid-battle. Black pieces appeared cornered, a story everyone believed. Clara tapped a pawn once and stepped back, inviting possibility to reroute. The move was not dramatic, it was decisive, a small correction changing the math of survival. Asher traced the board's new geometry and felt the thrill of strategy revealing secret exits. Wealth had taught him to expect highways. The pawn taught alleys, switchbacks, and patience. He saw how limited his questions had been, built on outcomes rather than positions. The board suggested a wider application. When trapped, change the question. When surrounded, shift the angle. When dismissed, advance one square with purpose. He understood why some victories never make noise. The match belonged to those who could suffer without surrender. A child's fingertip had rearranged his future with a nudge almost nobody would notice. In class, an old photograph glowed on the projector. Faces smudged by coal, shoulders bent by necessity. Previously, Asher had learned to skim such images for dates and names. Now, the frame filled with human temperature. He saw hunger stored in posture, tenderness disguised as proximity, and futures negotiated across pay envelopes and supper tables. The Industrial Revolution stopped behaving like bullet points and became a weather pattern moving through lives.
He noticed the boy in the corner stealing a glance at the man beside him and understood inheritance without paperwork. Words like progress and efficiency lost their shine. Words like exhaustion and bargaining gained weight. The room adjusted its focus, peers surprised to hear a voice they had assumed couldn't carry. For the first time, Asher felt the hum of comprehension that doesn't ask permission. Understanding stood up in his chest and took attendance.
Cafeterias enforce laws the Constitution never wrote. Trays slam verdicts. Laughter drafts amendments. Brent Jennings curated an audience the way some boys curate sneakers, always after the rarest reaction. He circled Asher with barbs sharpened by certainty that money keeps you safe even when kindness doesn't. The old Asher would have met mockery with a smirk or vanished behind a screen. The new one absorbed the sting and listened beneath it. He recognized fear disguised as swagger, inheritance working like a leash. Humiliation still burned, but the flame illuminated structure, the system that turns boys into performers for one another's dread. He cleaned his tray and walked away without demanding closure. Power thrives on immediate response. Denial of that oxygen unsettled the room. By the time the bell rang, he understood that some victories are measured in how quietly you refuse the script. Back in Victor's study, awards reflected light like polished shields. Framed magazine covers froze triumph in glossy eternity. Asher looked past spectacle towards subtler texts. A young entrepreneur with eyes wired for midnight. A workshop masquerading as an office. A mattress rolled in the corner near burnt coffee. He found a snapshot tucked behind a certificate, a stern man and a boy gripping a report card with conflicting hope and terror. Legacy rearranged into a chain, each link forged from expectation and withheld softness. The room felt less like a shrine and more like a museum of survival strategies. He realized success can be a reaction to hunger rather than a celebration of joy. The past stepped out of costume and showed its jitters. He left the study with a map of his father's injuries, not an excuse but an explanation, and a clarity that hurt the right way.
Empathy alters posture before policy. Asher's shoulders dropped an inch, not from defeat, but from understanding a weight that wasn't his. He pictured Victor's first office, 4 walls and a wager, ambition scavenged from panic. He pictured a child learning that approval travels with achievement and never rides for free. The realization didn't absolve the present, it contextualized the temperature of every room in the house. Empathy did not ask him to like the hardness, it asked him to see the architecture beneath it. He walked hallways differently, greeting staff whose names he had rarely used, noticing the efficiency that kept his days frictionless. A gardener's hands held seasons. A housekeeper's cart carried more than polish, it carried rent. He began to understand that dignity accumulates interest when someone bothers to notice it. Pain taught him to stop narrating and start witnessing, a small revolution with quiet manners. Progress crept into the gradebook like dawn into a curtained room, first a suggestion, then a shape. Victor examined the numbers with an auditor's suspicion. Improvement without control raises alarms in men trained to mistrust luck. The study's air chilled a degree as trust failed to appear. Accusation, carved from old fear, arrived efficient and merciless. The ledger of fatherhood demanded proof, not presence. Asher stood in that curated cold and learned how easily growth can be misread when eyes are trained on outcomes, not effort. The accusation didn't reverse his progress, it confirmed the stakes. Empires mistake subtlety for deceit. The house, alert to drama, held its breath. In the corridor, a portrait seemed to lean in. He left the room without theatrics, carrying a truth weightier than any grade. Transformation depends less on applause and more on the private decision to continue anyway.
Rage visited without the smash of doors or crash of glass. It took a chair in Asher's chest and waited, asking what kind of man he intended to become with it. The old pattern begged for spectacle. The new one insisted on trajectory. He walked the estate like a field medic, triaging illusions and choosing which to tourniquet first. Pride threatened to reclaim the room. he starved it of attention. Somewhere, Clara read under a lamp that had seen more late nights than celebrations. The map of his father's injuries returned to mind, not to excuse accusations, but to predict them. He realized his life had been a negotiation with comfort. Now it would be a negotiation with purpose. When he lay down, he didn't sleep quickly. He rehearsed persistence instead. The dull, necessary muscle that moves mountains, one shovel at a time. Truth often hides inside necessity. Susan's story emerged not as drama, but as exhaustion finally allowed to speak. Years earlier, a breach had ransacked the company's pride, and the board demanded a name to stabilize markets. Rob Thompson's career, built line by patient line of code, collapsed under a verdict rendered at speed. Families don't survive scandals with grace. They survive them with extra shifts and smaller meals. Clara, raised on a legacy of careful observation, had watched her mother work and her uncle fade. Teaching Asher had never been charity. It was strategy crafted from love and scarcity. The mansion had employed their bodies. The plan conscripted its heirs' attention. The revelation turned lessons into a mission. Asher felt the old apathy stagger under the weight of a purpose that didn't center him. Justice, it turned out, made a better fuel than shame.
Stacks of reports rose like gray cities on a library table. Asher built bridges between dates, departments, and decisions, mapping traffic where others saw dead ends. Logs that once spoke in static began to confess. He followed money like a river, not a line, and found eddies where it stalled and reappeared suspiciously clean. Clara's method worked across disciplines and floors. He marked coincidences that weren't, and coincidences that hid. The mansion, repository of curated truths, became a laboratory for inconvenient ones. Hours passed without witness. The staff's quiet ballet faded to a distant rhythm. He moved from screen to printout to margin notes, learning that investigation is mostly patience wearing comfortable shoes. Somewhere in the middle of a spreadsheet, the old version of him died with little fanfare. The new one kept turning pages, hunting not a villain but a pattern that named one. Patterns defend themselves with decoys. Early threads pointed back to Rob Thompson, tidy enough to satisfy a board addicted to closure. The narrative clicked unpleasantly into place, tempting surrender. Asher paused, listening for the sound Clara taught him to hear when the story cheats, an almost imperceptible rattle behind the wall. He refused the convenience of confirmation and widened the map. A reused credential appeared where it shouldn't, then again where it couldn't. He traced access times that didn't respect sleep. The decoy frayed under attention, revealing seams stitched in haste. False leads appeal to the exhausted. They offer relief instead of truth. He remembered the bus ride, the cafeteria, the kitchen's heat, places where reality never apologized. Choosing difficulty felt like joining the right team. The investigation pivoted without drama, and the room brightened a degree, as if the house approved of stubbornness.
Encrypted transfers left footprints, arrogant enough to assume no one would notice. Asher noticed. He followed currency through shell accounts and airless entities that smelled of paperwork and strategy. The path gathered names, then narrowed to one that anchored the school's cruelest grin to the company's worst wound. Leonard Jennings Sr. emerged from behind legal furniture, a man built to weaponize respectability. Dates aligned with board votes, whispers aligned with market dips. A neat story began to look like someone's careful painting over rot. The pattern did not need fireworks to convince. It needed only repetition. He printed timelines, circled correlations, and arranged evidence by the gravity of its pull. When he looked up, the library felt smaller, not from fear, but from focus. The boy born inside a fortress of conclusions had learned to file a motion for discovery and win. School hallways love symmetry. Brent's swagger extended his father's reach, a domestic monarchy parading between lockers. Asher observed him with a new lens, not forgiving the cruelty, but recognizing its architecture. Arrogance traveled down bloodlines like heirlooms, polished and presented each generation. Brent's taunts landed softer against someone armored by purpose.
The insults felt rehearsed because they were rehearsed, written by a man in a boardroom who needed the world to confirm his version of power. Compassion arrived without invitation and without absolution. Asher realized he had spent years auditioning for roles in other people's plays. Now he carried his own script, quiet and relentless. When the bell rang, he didn't look back. Mirroring reveals more than opposition. It reveals destination, if nothing changes. The thought chilled and clarified. He turned away from the reflection and toward the work waiting at home.
The study met him with its usual chill, leather and glass staging a trial that rarely acquitted. Asher set the folder on Victor's desk, not as challenge, but as offering. Documents arranged themselves into an undeniable narrative, each page a rung on a ladder leading out of a lie. Columns of numbers lined up like witnesses. Access logs spoke in timestamps that refused to lie for anyone. The room's temperature shifted from authority to attention. Victor read. Silence stretched. The house listened, 1,000 square feet suddenly intimate. Fathers and sons often negotiate through storms. This moment preferred still water. Credibility transferred, ledger-like, from suspicion to fact. The office's portraits watched a correction enter the family accounting. Truth owed a balance, and payment had finally arrived. Asher stood steady, not reciting, not pleading, letting evidence do the work pride never would. Power resists gravity until it doesn't. As Victor followed the timeline's cruel efficiency, his posture lost a fraction of height, then another. Tears gathered like weather long forecast and finally arriving. Control, once his most reliable instrument, misfired against a son who had chosen method over manipulation. The study transformed from throne room to confessional without rearranging a chair. Years of hardness cracked along a seam he had pretended didn't exist. The ledger he kept for the world encountered a different arithmetic: apology, accountability, repair. He saw the cost of speed disguised as decisiveness, the way a boardroom's appetite can devour an innocent name. For a moment, the empire looked fragile, not because markets move, but because men refuse sight. He closed the folder and, for the first time, allowed the possibility that leadership includes the courage to kneel in private and stand differently in public.
Restoration rarely returns things to their original shine. It gives them an honest one. Rob Thompson's name moved from rumor to record. The company's statement crisp but inadequate for the years subtracted. Compensation arrived with zeros. Dignity arrived with eye contact. The reinstatement felt less like a favor and more like a correction long overdue. Susan stood smaller than the press release and larger than the boardroom apology, hands folded around relief she'd earned 10,000 times. Clara watched quietly, carrying a victory that would never trend. Asher observed the machinery of justice creak into motion, understanding that even truth needs advocates with stamina. In corridors once hostile, colleagues unlearned suspicion in slow steps. The scandal's echo faded into file cabinets and lessons. A family's center of gravity shifted back toward possibility. Redemption, imperfect and beautiful, took the elevator down and walked home. The study's table, once a battlefield, became a drafting board. Maps of thought spread beside ledgers of fact. Victor listened without interrupting, a skill newer than any acquisition. Asher explained bridges between events and ideas, how history whispers to physics, how a kitchen teaches strategy, how a garden teaches repair. The conversation did not fix the past, it built a causeway over it. The house softened in small ways. A chair pulled closer, a pen shared, a silence respected. Fatherhood, stripped of showmanship, tried on humility and found it wearable. Sonship, freed from audition, practiced clarity instead of defiance. They didn't reach agreement on everything. They reached agreement on attention. In a corner of the room, dust motes twirled without needing permission. The family ledger added a new column neither had budgeted for: time spent seeing rather than proving.
Paperwork replaced ceremony. when Asher opted out of Northwood. The elite corridors released him with a shrug that masked surprise. Public school greeted him without velvet ropes or polished plaques, a place where victories traveled home on foot. He entered hallways that measured status differently, by kindness rendered, by effort spent, by resilience displayed. Desks bore initials carved by students who needed to exist somewhere. Teachers stretched resources the way families stretch paychecks. He joined the line, not as spectacle, but as peer, shoulders level with the crowds. The bus ride changed flavor. Humiliation fermented into solidarity. At night, he studied with a purpose that didn't require applause. The choice felt less like rebellion and more like alignment. Wealth didn't evaporate, it stepped aside. For the first time, his reflection in a window looked like a person he might trust. Moonlight laid quiet silver across the garden as Clara closed her great-grandfather's journal, the pages heavy with maps of attention. The estate, once a monument to control, now breathed like a place that could learn. Asher stood in a yard that had trained him to notice, surrounded by hedges that no longer formed a maze. Legacies often celebrate accumulation. This one discovered subtraction. Less pride, less blindness, fewer conclusions disguised as facts. He pictured futures where power listens sooner, where wealth funds repair before reputation, where sons inherit questions instead of quotas. Inside, Victor reviewed a calendar that included space for uncertainty. Outside, the oak held its ground, patient as always. The lesson did not crescendo, it settled. Seeing is not a trick. It is a discipline, renewed daily. The house kept its glow, but the light felt different, warmer, earned, shaped by eyes finally open.